This is the story of the Spence family, or my ancestors. In many ways, the story of the Spences is the story of Canada. Many of them were present and even played an influential part in its history. I have put together just a very few of the stories, and I hope that you enjoy them. Jacob Spence and his wife Elizabeth lived with their family of 9 children in the city of Donegal, Ireland. Jacob was a merchant of farm produce who was also a temperance lecturer, which was not a popular idea in Ireland at the time. By 1861, Jacob's business affairs were so bad that he was forced to hand everything over to his creditors. The family decided to start out a new life in Canada, so they took some of the money they had left and booked passage to the new land. They set out for Canada on the steamship the North American on the 12th of July in 1861. They arrived in Toronto 11 days later with 9 children, the youngest only 7 weeks old. Before they moved to Muskoka, they tried a few different businesses in Toronto. These included a family baking business on York Street and a farm over the Don. None of these was successful, so the family decided to take some of the grant land that the government was giving out in Muskoka. They set out for Muskoka on November 1st, 1863, on a rickety one-horse wagon with all of their possessions on a similar wagon. At the time, the road to Muskoka area was very rough, just a trail through the bush. It took them 6 days to get to Muskoka Falls, and from there, Uffington. Near their plot of land by Uffington, all 11 Spences had to stay in a 12 by 12 cabin that was already occupied by a man named Irwin. He took them in during this time while they were building a similar shack of about the same size for themselves. The first winter was described in the notes of Frank Spence, who was one of Jacob's grandsons, as one of
hardship, sickness, and sorrow, for in that isolated region, 40 miles from medical aid, 4-year-old John Frederick, unable to withstand the rigors of the winter, took sick and died.
Over the next few years, Elizabeth returned to Toronto twice for the birth of 2 sons, first Joseph in 1865, then Benjamin, my great-grandfather, in 1867. For some years, they tried homesteading in a few different places in Muskoka, but all efforts failed to carve a living out of the rocks. The family finally gave up farming in Muskoka for good, sold their livestock, and moved back to Toronto in November of 1871. They came back to Muskoka for vacations in later years to some land that Jacob owned on Spence Lake. Our family still owns this land, and we still go up there to this day for vacations. When they came back to Toronto, they were very poor and lived in Corktown for a while until they got settled down. Jacob was soon interested in the bee business and was shortly selling beekeeping tools to other people, as well as having a small honey farm himself. This helped the family back onto their feet, and he was in the bee business until his death in 1892. Corktown was the area in Toronto where all of the very poor Irish people lived, and it was a very squalid place to live. Living here helped shape Ben's life a little more, witnessing the horrors of drinking and poverty. Many of the men would be drunk and beating up their families and any others who happened to cross their path. It was a really bad situation, but especially devastated the poor people. A few other factors that helped shape Ben's life at the time were his parents, a mother that was pouring her soul into the suffrage movement, and a father who was largely dedicating his life to temperance. In fact, Jacob's dying words to Ben were, "Fight the drink, Ben." Jacob had gone through all of these hardships to ensure that his children had a better life in Canada, and he lived long enough to see all of his children that survived succeed in life. This was his reason for coming to Canada. He died a happy man, knowing all of his children would make him proud. Jacob's son, Jake, played a role in the Northwest Rebellion, which was in 1885. When Louis Riel's struggle for Métis rights was rising in what is now Saskatchewan, the government responded by raising Canada's first national military force. Jake was a part of the Queen's Own Rifles and was sent to the front. He distinguished himself in the Battle of Cut Knife Hill against Poundmaker's warriors by grabbing a wounded comrade while under heavy fire, shooting at the enemies with a pistol in one hand, and carrying the man on his shoulder. He became the hero of the hour and was awarded an illuminated address. Jacob Spence was also present in the tent when Poundmaker surrendered to General Middleton, which he refers to in his letters.
Dear Mother, another week has gone and still no word from home. Poundmaker came in and surrendered on Tuesday, but most of his braves are still on the warpath. I was at the council he had with General Middleton, and I heard nearly all that had passed between them. The old fellow seemed to be badly broken up and was very humble, but a great many of his young braves still want to fight and will not lay down their arms.
Dan McLean Spence was found and adopted by the Spence family when he was 2 years old. This was when they vacationed in Muskoka and Ben was 12 years old. As an adult, Dan moved to Peterborough and became a part of the 57th Regiment. When they heard news of the Boer War, Dan was one of the first to sign up and he was off to South Africa. Unfortunately, a short time before the war was over, he was shot to death by the Boers. A few years later, the city of Peterborough named an ambulance Dan Spence in his honor. Ben Spence was born in 1867, the same year Canada became an independent nation. He was born in Toronto, but his early years were spent in Muskoka and back in Toronto's Corktown, which greatly influenced him. The poverty and bad effects of alcohol were all around him, and he dreamed of a better society. He worked tirelessly for the rest of his life for Prohibition. At his Methodist Sunday school, Ben met a young Joe Atkinson, who years later became owner of the Toronto Star. Joe shared Ben's concern for the poor and would remain a friend throughout his life. In Ben's part of Toronto, poverty was everywhere. Slums were the main kind of housing, and many people didn't even have that. These people were the casualties of the capitalist system that reigned unregulated. The governments at the time offered no social safety net, and people were pretty much on their own. Many people turned to churches for help. The social gospel movement arose in the progressive Protestant churches as a solution to the problem of poverty.
It was a social movement developed by the more liberal, progressive members of the Protestant denominations, intended to try and meet the ills of society, and it covered everything from temperance, because at that time alcoholism was rampant and a huge problem, through to widows' pensions, workers' compensation, and all kinds of social programs or supports.
The Methodist Church was at the heart of the social gospel movement. The Spences were a part of the Methodist Church, and Ben became a Methodist minister, graduating from Victoria College in 1900. He was assigned a circuit rider job in the wilderness of northern Manitoba, where he worked for 3 years. In 1904, he rejoined his brother Frank in Toronto, and the two brothers became leading figures in the Prohibition movement. He had promised his father that he would fight for prohibition, and he was an advocate of temperance his whole life. He became the secretary of the Ontario-Dominion Alliance in 1905, and later for all of Canada. He spoke publicly every chance he got, all over North America and Britain. He was supported in the press by his old friend Joseph Atkinson in his Toronto Star.
In the early 20th century, Toronto is a cruel, heartless place. Men and women often abandon their children to the gutter, and a life of drunkenness and crime. Joseph Atkinson's Star devotes front-page coverage to their misery. Every reporter is assigned to write about the slums.
He was featured in many political cartoons at the time. Finally, Prohibition came to Ontario in 1916 with the Ontario Temperance Act, also known as the OTA, and lasted until 1927. When booze became legal again, he was right back on it, with temperance speeches and campaigns to keep some parts of Toronto dry. The fight against alcohol was the central cause of his life. In 1918 and 1919, the Spanish influenza swept the world and is still the worst-known epidemic in history. Ben fell ill, and the nurse that was assigned to him was Elizabeth Satterley. They were married in 1920 when he was 53 years old. The Toronto Star related a humorous account of how the couple tried to escape the reception party, but were blocked by scavenger carts. Ben and Bess had 2 daughters, Elizabeth, my grandmother, in 1923, and Isabel a year and a half later. By then he was 56, and had thought he would never have a family. They became the light of his life. Through his friendship with Joseph Atkinson, he became the Washington correspondent for the Toronto Star from 1928 to 33. At 61 years of age, when most people think of retirement, he moved his young family to Washington. One of his first assignments was an interview with Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was then the governor of New York. Ben was very impressed with the man that would later become president. They would meet again over the years, and Roosevelt later said that Ben was
the most charming man in public life I ever met.
In 1933, the Spence family moved back to Canada. The Depression was at its deepest, and there was much poverty and hunger.
There was still depression in Canada after we came back to Canada, and I can remember that we'd be eating a meal and somebody'd knock at the door. You know, people would come begging for food, and my mother, they'd give half what we were eating to somebody at the door. And it really bothered him. He cared about people. He wasn't, he didn't think, oh, this guy lost his job, I'm glad I got mine, or something like that. He really cared. It broke his heart.
Many progressive people across the country shared these concerns, and so a new political party was formed.
The alternative was the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. If something had to be done, they were prepared to make the sacrifices that were needed to make it happen.
This is Canada's first socialist party. And Canada's only Labour MP, J.S. Woodsworth.
A severe condemnation still rests upon indifference. We have tried to provide for the poor. Yet have we tried to alter the social conditions that lead to poverty?
The CCF was the political party of the social gospel movement. They advocated universal pensions and health care, rights of women and minorities, children's allowance, unemployment insurance, and workers' compensation. Ben joined in the early days as he believed this party was exactly what Canada needed. Ben ran in their first election in 1935, and although he lost, 8 CCF members were elected. Among them were 3 of Ben's good friends, J.S. Woodsworth, M.J. Caldwell, and Tommy Douglas. These men and the CCF would greatly change Canada.
It is 1936, and 5,000 miles from Canada, there is a fascist insurrection in Spain. General Francisco Franco wages civil war against the government. The legally elected Republicans are backed by the Soviets. Germany and Italy provide arms for Franco. Norman Bethune, a surgeon and a socialist, is one of the few Canadians who sees the fight for what it is.
The World War has started. It's democracy against fascism. It is in Spain that the real issues of our time are going to be fought out. It is there that democracy will survive or die.
As well as Bethune, Ben Spence and some of his socialist colleagues also saw this conflict as a fight between fascism and democracy that could trigger a war in Europe, so they formed a committee.
They formed a committee called the Committee to Aid Spanish Democracy. And my father was the head of that. He was the chairman of that committee. And they sent quite a few young men over to Spain. They also sent 2 or 3 ambulances over. And there were 3 ambulances that were sent out over from Canada, and funds from Canada supported these ambulances, and one was, they named the Ben Spence after him.
With these ambulances, Norman Bethune set up his mobile blood transfusion facilities to treat the wounded right on the battlefield. This is the first time this has ever been done in warfare and saved many lives. The men from Canada called themselves the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion in honor of the great Canadian reformers of 100 years previous. Even though Prime Minister Mackenzie King enacted a law making it illegal for Canadians to serve in Spain, they still went over and fought. Franco's fascists, with the backing of Hitler's Luftwaffe, overwhelmed the Republicans, and he ruled Spain until 1975. The MacPaps were sent home. Only about half of them survived. In 1955, because of his lifelong interest in world peace, Ben went on a 3-month peace tour of 9 European countries at the age of 87. He attended the World Assembly for Peace in Helsinki, Finland, as a delegate. He was a Toronto Telegram reporter for the Geneva Conference, the first major meeting since the end of World War II of the 4 big powers, Britain, France, USA, and USSR, to ease tensions in the Cold War. He also visited 4 cities in Russia as the guest of the Russian Orthodox Church. This was during the height of the Cold War, when few Westerners were allowed in. In 1948, Ben's first grandson was born, Gary, my dad. Ben was absolutely delighted. He didn't think that he would be a father, never mind a grandfather. Eventually, there were 7 more grandchildren, and he adored them all. In early 1960, Ben was returning home from a day of meetings downtown when he was struck by a car. He was 92 years old. Even on the last day of his life, he was still fighting alcohol. The values and political movements that shaped this country and the social programs which today we take for granted were all hard-fought battles by the people like Jacob and Ben Spence.